Have you ever wondered why it seems like the rich always come out on top? No matter the circumstances. They never seem to feel the pain of their own mistakes, instead passing that pain along to the rest of us. In short, it comes down to diversification. In metaphor, they're at the casino, but they're both the house and the player. In vulgarities, they're assholes who don't give a fuck. I'm Botanical Lich, and here's the bee. There has been no shortage of financial crises in the last 30 years. The dot-com bubble, the 2008 housing crash, mortgage securities crash, the COVID scare, and Liberation Day. The stock market, something that was marketed, to me at least, as a safe and stable investment, has seemingly been a chaotic and turbid investment for the entirety of the S&P 500's life. And yet, it's still hailed as a good investment, and it does give, on average, 8 to 10% yearly returns. So what gives? As with anything that exists for long enough in capitalism, the stock market has evolved, if it wasn't at its inception, into a vehicle for siphoning money upwards to the rich and the super rich. It doesn't work all on its own, though. It's part of a web of institutions that the rich can easily manipulate. In the good times, this means the rich can grow their capital at much higher rates than the average person. In the bad times, it means they can defend themselves from the worst outcomes. Let's start with the government, because I think it's just about the only part of the system that doesn't benefit. If you think of the system as a bicycle, and the distance traveled as the accumulations of the rich, the government is like an electric assistance motor, giving it a little boost whenever there's a bump in the road. I'm sure that most of us can remember the disdain that the general public felt during the mortgage securities collapse. Banks were found to be responsible for issuing mortgages that had low chances of being able to be upheld by the recipient, then they bundled those mortgages into packets in order to reduce their risk and sold those packets to the highest bidders. Finally, once those fraudulent mortgages started to fall through, the banks ruthlessly foreclosed on homes that they had approved the purchase of, knowing that this would be the likely outcome. And what was their punishment for such blatant poor decision-making and malice? The federal government, under the direction of Barack Obama, handed them a check for $700 billion. In the end, only $430 billion ended up being invested, and all of that was eventually recouped. But it sent a pretty clear message. If your industry messes up, the government will save you, and there won't be any consequences, with most of the high-level executives avoiding firings and demotions, let alone jail time. You can observe similar situations in the COVID-19 crisis. Hospitals who did not have their own reserves of medicine, protective equipment, and medical equipment were given these things by the government. Obviously, it is good that the government had their own stockpiles and resources, and that they distributed those resources. It was a matter of public health at that point, and the distribution of resources is the correct response. However, the hospitals faced little in the way of ramifications for their lack of preparedness. Hospitals, remember, are private, for-profit institutions. They make money off of every procedure that they do and every patient that visits. I think that it's even more clear when we look at the airline industry. COVID-19 caused a lot of people to stay home from work, and especially from travel. Different countries put in travel restrictions, and many people simply didn't want to expose themselves to a potentially deadly disease. Air travel plummeted, and along with it, airline companies' profits. This all makes sense. Cause and effect. The problem is that airlines weren't prepared for it. Large businesses are frequently incentivized to operate on thin margins, either reinvesting most of their money or paying it out for different things. As such, when there's a massive loss of income, the company is immediately thrown into critical care mode. Something has to give. Generally, employee wages are an easy savings to pull in, because in companies' minds, employees are more easily replaceable than contracts and equipment. The airlines were especially exposed to this risk because, on average, more than 50% of commercial airplanes in the United States are in the air. This means it's possible to operate an airline with substantially less space to store aircraft than you have aircraft. When flights grind to a halt, these airlines literally have nowhere to put their planes, meaning that they have to eat massive costs, either by flying empty planes or renting space to store them. So, once again, in order to maintain essential services for the United States to operate properly, private companies were handed billions of dollars. $63 billion, in fact. Which just happens to be the amount of money the bottom 50% of taxpayers paid to the federal government in 2022. Once again, I'm in favor of this distribution of money given the circumstances. The money was primarily used to keep airline workers employed, and to keep airlines from massively downsizing their capacity, which would have had major ramifications once travel ramped back up. The point remains, however, that the government is frequently stepping in to protect private businesses from their own short-sightedness. If you ran a small business and suddenly your income dropped precipitously, Even if you didn't have control over the reason, you would be told that your business should have had a safety plan, or wasn't market viable, even if similar stores were doing fine before and after whatever caused your income to drop. Large corporations, especially those that handle necessary services, are not held to this same standard. The government steps in for the good of the people and the economy, and these companies get to reap the rewards of never having to worry about their own crises. You may currently be hearing people talk about the AI bubble this way, saying that even if these companies stop getting funding, that the government will step in to save them because they're providing necessary computative and defense services. I don't think that they are providing necessary services, and I don't think that the government will step in this case, but who knows? The ramifications of an AI collapse might be too big to ignore. That's how the well-off take advantage of the government's willingness to, / need to, keep the wheels of the economy turning. Now let's take a look at the wheel of wealth accumulation itself. I think it can be separated into 3 broad aspects. I'm not a financial or economics expert, but I would separate them into 1. Speculative investments, 2. Physical investments, and 3. Cash assets. The availability of the wealthy to have large numbers of each of these assets is how they shield themselves from consequences, and how they hasten their accumulation of wealth. Broadly, I'm thinking of speculative investments as things like stocks and venture capital. They are usually the most volatile and the hardest to predict, but they also provide almost infinite growth potential. See the S&P 500 increasing like 70% over the last 3 years, let alone the 1,000+% returns on things like Bitcoin. Yes, Bitcoin is a speculative asset. It doesn't matter if that's not what they wanted it to be when they made it. It is now. Its value is based mostly on consensus, which means it's speculative. Physical investments tend to be less volatile because they have, quote, real value, unquote. That is to say, they will always be worth something. Houses provide value as shelter, copper and oil are constantly consumed by industry, and while gold breaks away from this somewhat, it still is an important resource for electronics and status. Physical investments certainly still go through their booms and busts, but importantly, those aren't generally directly tied to the movements of speculative investments. Cash is cash, but also things like bonds and loans, which can generally be traded for other assets or sold directly for cash. While bonds and loans have a small chance of falling through, they are usually protected by collateral, so total loss is unlikely, similar to physical assets. The only thing that generally heavily depreciates the value of cash assets is the decrease of the value of the dollar itself. This is where the wheel comes in. If the value of the dollar falls, generally the price of physical assets will increase. If a house has a real value of $100,000, but then the value of the dollar drops 20%, the house's value will rise by a similar amount. In fact, if we balance the scales perfectly, the price of the house goes up by 25%, because it now takes $125,000, which each have a real value of 80% of a dollar, to reach the real $100,000 value of the house. In this example, if I own the house before the dollar drops, then sell that house for $125,000, when the dollar recovers to its original value, I'll have $125,000 of real value. Or I can purchase another house with a real value of $100,000 and still have $25,000 left. Now, these transactions are never completely frictionless, and everything's value is constantly fluctuating to some extent or another. But the basic principle stands. By moving your wealth around, you can benefit by riding the surges and dips of different assets. A couple questions present themselves. Where did that $25,000 come from? And to hint at the answer with another question, who would spend $125,000 to buy a house that's only worth $100,000? Because the second question does answer the first. Someone has to be willing to buy that house for the original owner to make a profit on it. There are 2 answers that come to mind for me. The first one I'm generally okay with, although I'd like it not to happen with housing specifically, and the second one is pretty tragic. The first option is that another investor believes that the dollar is going to keep losing value. If the dollar were to drop another full 10% to 70% of its original value, then the house would now have a real value of almost $143,000. This second investor would have made another $18,000 in profit. If the value of the dollar recovered instead, the investor would have lost $25,000. In general, I'm fine with this, because the investors knew that there were some risks in betting against the already weakened dollar. This is money moving from one likely wealthy investor to another, and I don't really have much of a problem with that. See my earlier caveat about wishing housing wasn't an investment? While I've been saying real value, that isn't really a thing. A better way to think about it is taking the current value of an asset and setting that as a reference point for calculating the value of other assets. We do this all the time with cash value, but the value of cash is in and of itself variable. The second option is much more tragic. As I said before, houses have real worth. Bluntly, they exist as places for sheltering yourself and your property, and that is something that is necessary, and so has value to people. So if you're in need of that shelter, you could be forced into buying a home for more than it's worth. We saw both of these things feeding into each other during the housing crisis. Investors were buying homes, because the values of homes were rising relative to the dollar, so it was likely that you would be able to make a profit selling that house down the road. Because investors were so willing to buy homes, other investors were willing to buy those same homes at higher prices. This drove the prices of homes up. Real people looking for housing then had to buy those homes at their inflated prices as places to live. When investors stopped buying homes and the value of homes started to drop, the people who were living in homes saw their net worth plummet. For people that owned their homes outright, it was survivable, but for those who still had mortgages, they could find themselves upside down, meaning that their mortgage balance was now higher than the value of their home, meaning that even if they sold their home, they would still owe the bank money after the fact. Some banks had clauses that allowed them to foreclose on upside-down loans. Some people lost their jobs and couldn't make payments, and some people had to move for personal reasons. And guess who swept in and purchased all of those now massively undervalued homes? Rich investors. The same class of people who drove up home prices and made profits off renting and selling them were now profiting off the aftermath of the disaster those actions caused. It may not have been the exact same people, but it was other wealthy people who were able to move their assets around and grab up these undervalued homes. As another grossly oversimplified example, let's say you have $1 million in cash bonds, $1 million in gold, and $1 million in the stock market. Let's give them each a starting real value of 100 to help us keep track. In this example, the president introduces an economically disastrous tariff policy. It's going to affect consumer confidence and spending and drives the price of the stock market down. As the stock market starts to trend downwards, people want to switch into a more stable asset, like gold, which retains its value against inflation and even frequently makes a profit. The price of gold goes up and the stock market goes down. Let's say gold goes up 20% and the stock market drops 20%. You still have $3 million in total, and you redistribute that money evenly again. When the president walks back his tough talk, the stock market and gold both return to their original values. Gold's real value drops from 120 to 1, 17%, but the stock market's real value increases from 80 to 100, which is 25%. You lose $17,000 in gold, but gain $25,000 in stocks, a profit of $8,000. Let's say, in the same scenario, you think that this is going to be a short-term drop. The stock market has been recovering quickly recently due to interest in technology investments. So you move 10% of the value of your cash and gold into the stock market. You now have $0.9 million in cash, $1.08 million in gold, and $1.12 million in the stock market. In the next couple of days, the president walks back his tariff policy. The stock market rebounds to its previous value, meaning it's actually up 25%, but gold loses half of its real gains, about 8%, and your loan bonds lose 10% of their trade value due to trade uncertainty. You now have $1.4 million in stock, $994,000 in gold, and $810,000 in cash. $3.2 million in total. You've made $200,000 by making pretty insubstantial reallocations of your money. It is important to point out that moves in the three spaces aren't always proportional, but they also mostly trend upwards, other than cash, which trends downwards due to steady inflation. So what? Anyone can move their money around, you might say. Except they can't. If you're between the ages of 40 and 20, you've probably heard people saying, if you were smart, you would have bought a house during the housing crash. But during the housing crash, you didn't have any assets that you could leverage in order to buy a house. In fact, the housing crash caused an economic shockwave in the stock market, and the uncertainty in the stock market caused companies to lay off large amounts of workers to save up cash. In fact, the only thing that gained proportional or real value was cash. There was deflation during the Great Recession, meaning that cash was worth more than it had been in the past. The only problem was that many people had lost their jobs and therefore their cash income. They couldn't use the cash they had to make investments because they needed it on hand to buy necessities. In fact, they were having to sell their currently undervalued investments to buy necessities. It was the wealthy who had the flexibility to use their now boosted cash assets to purchase the suppressed assets that the poor were being forced into selling. When things returned to normal, the wealthy class had gained wealth share during a financial crisis they caused. Similarly, this happened during COVID-19. The stock market dropped and people got fired. Those people then had to sell their stocks and other assets at depressed prices to live, and then the stock market roared back. Who had the money to buy up massive swaths of undervalued stock? The wealthy. Their wealth insulates them from needing to sell anything when it's undervalued. Then, by spreading that wealth around, they can take advantage of anomalous changes in the values of assets. Changes that they can be reasonably confident are going to return to normal in the next few years. It's like riding a bike downhill. Just by having multiple assets, they accumulate wealth very easily. If they make the effort and pedal, moving their assets around reactively, they can make even more distance at a quicker speed. They don't need to worry about getting tired either, because if they ever happen to come to an uphill, the assistance motor, read the government, will jump in and power them over the obstacle. This is what people mean when they say the system is rigged. This is why people say the government helps the rich more than the poor. This is why, no matter what happens, the rich won't be the ones who feel the pain. I just wanted to point out that between me writing this and recording, some chicanery happened with the silver market. Prices dropped as much as 40% in a single day. I saw this and, without much information, reactively invested $100, which is neither a large nor small amount of money for me personally to be risking on a potentially volatile investment. The next day, I had gained 7% on that investment. For me, that meant making a whole $7. But for someone who had the ability to invest $10,000 with the same level of intent as I invest $100, they would have earned $700, which is more than I earn in a week. The economy literally just operates at a different level when you have the money to take advantage of outlier scenarios. I would not suggest investing on a whim to anyone who is struggling to make ends meet, and any money you invest, especially into outlier scenarios, should be money you can withstand losing. But the rich have plenty of money they can lose, and one good investment can often wipe out the losses from multiple bad investments for them. Keep an eye on who benefits whenever something bad happens. Think about how much tax money you have to put into the government, and how much of that money gets used to bail out and support companies that are making bad decisions. Most importantly, remember that it's not hard to be rich. It's hard to get rich, and it's the hardest to lose those riches.